I'm thrilled to welcome today for this panel, Sarah Burns and David McMahon. They are both award-winning documentary filmmakers with more than a decade of experience each. Together, and with Ken Burns, they have written and directed and produced films like The Central Park Five, which won the Peabody Award for the Best Nonfiction Film in 2012, and other films like Jackie Robinson, the two-part biography for which they were nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Writing for a Nonfiction Program and won a WGA Award for documentary script. Other collaborations have included Lake Meadows, a public housing story, and the four-part biography of Muhammad Ali. Today, they are featuring their latest collaboration with Ken Burns, a film about Leonardo da Vinci, which premiered on PBS this past November. They are currently working on a film project about Reconstruction. Thank you all so much. Enjoy this program and enjoy the rest of the festival.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for being here. I'm Jake Borrett. I'm the festival director here. Thanks for having us, Brett and the Majestic. And glad you're essentially the opening event this morning here at the festival. And what a fun one that was. And Sarah Burns, Dave McMahon, two filmmakers out of Brooklyn, New York, who came down last night. And we're going to talk a lot about their work. And it's going to be very conversational. I know many of you have been here before, but it's their most recent work is Leonardo, which we saw a lot of, but they've done such great work that I wanted to, put together a clip reel where we really sort of got a taste of the different types of films they've done, and and go from there. So, guys, Leonardo. I mean, your Florentine Films, of course, is renowned for American historical documentaries, but then you actually went to Florence and made a film. So, and not an American. Why?
Yeah, this was definitely an unusual project for us, very different in a lot of ways. The idea came originally from Walter Isaacson, who was then writing a biography of Leonardo, and he had dinner with my dad and suggested he had done a Franklin biography also and was interviewed for my dad's Benjamin Franklin film, and he was sort of pushing this idea of doing Leonardo, and I think my dad was initially very dismissive of that. That's not really what we do. It's sort of outside of our wheelhouse. And after the dinner, he called us and said, Walter kept trying to get me to do a Leonardo da Vinci thing, and we were like, let's do that. Why not? What's stopping us?
A year in Florence.
Yeah, and I think that we were excited by the idea of taking on such a different subject. I mean, it's challenging in a lot of ways because the other films that we've made, that Dave and I have made, have been all set in the 20th century. So not only American subjects, but ones in which we have lots of photographs, lots of footage, eyewitnesses, people who knew our subject or who were the subject of the film that we could interview. And telling a story set more than 500 years in the past in another country, in another language, just presented such unique challenges that I think was really exciting to us. The possibilities that opened up stylistically in thinking about how we would tell that story, in terms of how we would visually represent this life that took place before photographs, before footage, and so we were really excited about that idea, the challenges and also the opportunities of it.
Yeah, there were a few things I think that after that phone call that we were able to discover immediately. One is there are these notebooks that Leonardo left behind, and they are like the sum total of his thinking and all the subjects that he was interested in. And they say that's maybe 50% of his actual output, but in there you find his studies on painting, on math, on geology, on engineering, and so you can really, in a comprehensive way, see his thinking on all these subjects. Another thing that we did was we started plugging in Leonardo and looking at the people who are sort of on the record about him, and it was easy to find pretty quickly an extraordinary group of people beyond art historians and beyond biographers who had this great passion for Leonardo da Vinci and maybe only one aspect of his life. And so we felt like we might have an opportunity to bring him to life on screen in a way that he hadn't been before if we use those notebooks as our pole star that would get us through his life, but we could have this ensemble cast of talking heads who we were electrified by how they felt about Leonardo, and we felt we could share their perspectives with the audience and then also bring to life particular studies that he did.
Yeah, and it's so rich, but it's such a different archive than you normally would work with, especially compared to a subject like Muhammad Ali, who was probably the most photographed person in the world at the time he was doing his thing. And so you have this, and you have these notebooks of his thoughts, and in some ways his mind, or what's left of it. And but the emotional record of him, there's not a lot of his personal life, and so we just talked about this a little bit, the idea that his brain is the story here, and it's not his emotional, it's not his relationships very much. How do you make a film like that?
Yeah, I mean, my dad often talks about the work that he does, that we do, as being emotional archaeology. He uses that phrase a lot, and I think it's a good description of this thing of trying to find story and sort of humanity in people's stories. And as you suggested with Leonardo, it's much harder to access his personal feelings about things. He did all of this writing, but it was not about how he felt about people or sort of his personal life, really. He was not a diarist. And so I think from the very beginning, like, what we could do is get inside his brain, and we started thinking about it a little bit more like an intellectual archaeology as opposed to an emotional one. And so that also opened us up to doing these other stylistic things too, not just because of the different materials we had access to, but also just using split screens. I think that was Dave's idea very early on, before we began editing. Started talking about and thinking about the ways visually that we might represent Leonardo's way of thinking. Right, he was this lateral thinker, and he made connections across all these different disciplines. He was thinking about, we think about him, is he an artist? Is he a scientist? He would not have made those distinctions, and he was interested in all of these different disciplines, and he saw the connections between them. And so using the split screens was about how to visually represent that, how to get inside his head, to give the audience some sense of all of the different things that he's looking at, that he's curious about, and to kind of to illustrate these kinds of connections and ideas that he's making. And that was really, I think, fun and exciting. Our editors really embraced that from the beginning too. Like, sure, let's experiment with this. We didn't know if it would work. It was like, let's give it a try.
It opens up so much visually, where you're sort of going beyond the historical record or the record directly tied to him or his era even. I mean, you're using, pictures of ferns or sunrise. It could be anything. And so it's so vast that where is the inspiration, or sort of the containment, if you will, of putting that into a film? Like, how do you work with that?
Well, again, it's the notebooks, and I think one thing you learn pretty quickly is that he's fascinated by nature. He thinks of himself as a disciple of experience, and so where that meets is he's out in the world observing and trying to understand the rules of nature, and then he wants to take them and apply them to his paintings or to his designs and sort of bend them in a particular way. And he thinks that he can be a second nature by doing that. And so, to Sarah's point earlier, if we can seek in nature with our camera crew what he was looking at, if we can find in those notebooks through drawings or through things he wrote, how he was drawing inspiration from that nature, and then we could see the work itself. Now you've got maybe 3 panels on the screen, and we're allowing everyone to connect those dots, but it's so sprawling too, the body of things he was interested in. But you begin to understand that maybe a painting becomes a scientific experiment, that he's not trying to portray a beautiful woman, he's trying to understand atmospheric perspective and why the sky is a particular color at this altitude and a different shade of blue at a higher altitude. And maybe once he's figured that out, he becomes less interested in the painting. At the same time, he's working on a mechanical design, and there's so much beauty in his rendering of it that it starts to feel like a piece of art. And so he sort of flipped it on his head. And so really again, that historical record is so thin, we cannot tell you where he was on most days, but if we stay with those notebooks and we just sort of let them be our pole star, we were grounded in something. And that sort of showed us the way. And so, but really, it is, for him, it's all about nature. And he's living at a time when coming up with some of the conclusions that he did might fly in the face of church teachings, and he could run into trouble for that. That didn't seem to bother him at all. He doesn't seem to get in any trouble. He's really a disciple of nature.
Yeah, and that's sort of amazing that he does have this life outside of the traditions of what was certainly a dominant church at the time. Yeah. And, he's gay as far as we understand his life, and he's very much this other existence, yet so dominant. Certainly how we look back on that period is like the pivotal figure. And I think it's Gopnik that says it's sort of this transition between antiquity and the ancient understanding of primitive understanding of the world to, enlightenment and scientific, and talk about that. I mean, visually you do that with these splits and stuff, but like, how do you do that where you're kind of in some ways setting the scene for all of modern civilization like, with one guy?
Yeah, there's sometimes a temptation to see Leonardo as this kind of alien figure. And in fact, Adam Gopnik, we sort of came to him to ask him about Leonardo because he had written, as I think a high school student, maybe even younger, like 12 years old, had written some sort of story, some essay about Leonardo being an alien. Like that was like an interest of his when he was like a 12-year-old. And so we thought, oh, well, I bet he'll have something interesting to say about Leonardo now too. But there is that temptation to see him as this kind of alien, like solitary figure who is like apart from his time. We see him as very modern. And that is in some ways, I think, appropriate to see him as incredibly modern because of the way that he was kind of prefiguring, foreseeing some of these scientific developments. He wasn't, he tried to design flying machines. He didn't succeed. None of those things would have actually taken flight. But the ideas that he had about those things were these very modern ideas. And we do eventually get there. And the things that he's discovering about the human heart, he was right. We couldn't prove it until we had MRIs. And so there is this thing that's incredibly modern and sort of futuristic almost about him. At the same time, he was very much a man of his time. And it's really important, and I think it's important to us in telling his story and making the film to make sure that we place him in that context, that he has these other extraordinary contemporary artists, thinkers. Like, he's not alone in that. He is unique in many ways, but he's not alone. And he's also literally not a solitary figure. There's also the temptation to see a genius like that as being sort of lonely, separate, apart from a community. And that was very much not the case either. He was, from the contemporary reports, someone who was fun to be around. Yeah. He liked to sing. He was sort of flamboyant. He was interesting. Like, you would want to hang out with him too. And so there's, it's about telling the story is about finding that balance between looking at his modernity and seeing him as this very modern figure, as I think we do, but also placing him in his context and understanding him as being influenced by these thinkers who have come before, and in turn influencing these other artists and thinkers who are his contemporaries and who come after.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you sort of see this bridge that's, again, it's not just him, but he's become the symbol of it, certainly. But it's what astounds me is, the notebooks are vast, but the actual sort of works, let alone completed works, are so few. I mean, this is a guy that has this place in our cultural understanding of Western civilization, yet he barely finished anything. And you're having to dig into his private books, which were, as you said, he didn't really get that much completed, yet he's so pivotal. And so what does that say about this genius, but failure to complete the job?
Well, it's funny, he does finish a lot of the works when he's working for Duke Sforza, who we don't know, maybe chop his head off if he doesn't deliver on the commission that he's been assigned. And so there was that type of pressure. And just to take it slightly a different way, it's interesting who he chooses to work for. He works for the church. He doesn't seem afraid of not delivering a commission. Maybe he is, like I said before, figured something out that he was really seeking in doing that painting, and so he doesn't deliver it to the church, or he doesn't deliver it to the merchant. But he does have to eat, and so you can in some ways see his life as a quest for the perfect patronage. So the Duke is a great patron because he can spend time on the court and meet all these people who have lots of information that he might be interested in. But at the same time, the Duke wants to hire him because he feels like he might know how to design machines of war, and this is a time of a lot of upheaval and constant warfare. The different city-states are partnering. They're trying to drive the French out. They're trying to each take over more land themselves. And so Leonardo, in a job application, presents himself as somebody who could design those machines, or he could map a city in a way that the army would find the map useful and could be more successful in the battlefield. And so, which also makes him, again, a creature of his times. And so I think probably in the end, he does find the perfect patron in Francois Premier, who's a young guy who's sort of seeking and somebody in Leonardo who can sort of tell him about the world and make him, as a young man, more sophisticated and present in a different way, and help him create a kind of renaissance in that pocket of the world, the way the Italians had done, and then give Leonardo the thing that he is seeking, which is the space to learn and study whatever he wants and come to his own conclusions. And so sometimes the works are incomplete to our eye, but actually he found out what it is he was looking for. Sometimes you imagine that he gets bored and that he moves on, but what he does leave us are those notebooks, which you've talked about, and they're tremendous volumes of them. They never get published in his lifetime. So at the end of his life, he's kind of a mystery because he hasn't left as much as we now know that of his output, and it's not as accessible. But there in those notebooks, you can see everything that he was interested in.
And even, he would not finish things and frustrate his patrons, the people who had hired him, but people kept hiring him. And I think that has to do with the fact that there was a recognition in his lifetime of his great talent. So even though he doesn't publish all of these writings, and I think he very much cared about being seen as an intellectual, not as a painter necessarily, but as an intellectual. But as a painter, he was very much recognized in his time. And so people did it's why the French king eventually tempts him up there. He's never left Italy, the Italian peninsula, but his fame has traveled. Word of the Last Supper, it's hidden in a monk's dining hall, but people know about it and they talk about it, and he's sort of famous for it, even at the time. And so it's interesting because despite the fact that he frequently disappointed his patrons, his talent sort of shone through enough that no one cared that much.
He was worth taking a risk on, I guess, because it was. And also that idea of he's a disciple of experience. He's not necessarily doing it for the completed work. No. He's doing it for the exploration. And I know how you guys talk about your work, and with Ken, it's often the fun for you isn't the finished film and getting the premiere. The fun is those months and years spent with Muhammad or spent with Leonardo. Talk about that, just doing the work of creativity.
Yeah, we saw the clip about the Last Supper. He tackles this painting that's been painted everywhere. It's on every monk's dining room wall. Right. He becomes interested in parts of it that none of his contemporaries or anyone before him ever had. You saw the clip, and so, but he wants it. It's a movie to him. It's this is one of the most dynamic moments that's ever happened in mankind. This guy telling his disciples, "One of you will betray me," and so he wants to render that in a way that it deserves, and that separates him from others. At the risk of reiterating exactly what the scene said, but even when he gets an assignment, it's about process. It's about getting that Bible. It's about reading all the different portrayals in the Bible of that moment. It's about studying the people in the square so that he can see when they are electrified by something someone has said, or when they're sharing a joke, or when they're disappointed, that he understands what all those emotions look like. It's about dissecting the human body so that he can see how all the muscles pull together when someone's having an emotional experience. He's going to such depths to understand whatever it is that he needs to render, and that comes through in the paintings. It's in the painting of one of the Duke's mistresses. He's got the mistress and she's looking towards a door, and you can imagine off the frame the Duke has just opened the door and she's responding to that, and so suddenly she has a whole inner life, and there's a whole drama unfolding in this painting. And it's not just a portrait of her, it's a moment unfolding. And that's how he saw the assignment of doing a portrait, was what can I learn about the human experience through delivering this thing that I've been assigned to do.
Yeah, I started thinking about this only at the very end, but the way that what I said before about how we sort of thought of the film as being intellectual as opposed to emotional archaeology, I think what I eventually came to understand about Leonardo is that what he was doing in his work was emotional archaeology, that those paintings are very much about going beyond the surface, not just as some of his contemporaries were beginning to do, to create something that looks three-dimensional in a different way. They're using perspective, they're using shading to make a person look, three-dimensional in space. He was doing that, but he was going way past that, and he was representing their emotions, their humanity, their sort of interior life on the panel, and that was not something that people were doing.
Well, and it's a combination of that, studying the tendons in a cadaver, that's this type of precision, unglamorous scientific study that then all right, logically translates into, drawing or sketching or painting the tendons in the neck, but what is that? That comes to being, the face of a disciple or the face of Jesus and so forth. So it's this sort of, again, the scientific method of the study and understanding it. And then in many ways, that's the beginning of enlightenment, right? That you're no longer in this mystical world of demons crawling out of places to eat you because you thought something wrong or whatever. It's like there's scientific method to do this. And that's such a pivotal moment in our time that, I guess in particular in the Italian Renaissance. I mean, what was it like doing the film? So I invited Sarah and Dave to the original film festival. We did the Central Park 5, which is their film. We had, Kevin was here. I think probably some of you were here for that, an amazing moment. They were in Italy, which is a perfectly good excuse to not be here, but now they're here. But they spent more or less a year. I mean, it's kind of everyone's dream. Oh yeah, we have a job to do for a year in Italy. What was that like? And I mean, the language, just doing a production there. How was that?
It was fun.
Yeah. can't complain about that.
I guess that was a bit of a rhetorical question, right? It was really hard, no to it.
We weren't going to go over there and spend this sort of work that we often do with Ken is that he gives us a tremendous timeline. It's one of the great gifts of producing a movie with him is the time you have to learn, understand the subject, and to work on it until you've created the thing that it needs to be. But we weren't going to go over there and sit in the archives and try to uncover new facts about Leonardo. People have been seeking those facts for a very long time, and they dedicate lifetimes to it. And so that's not what we were going to do. We were instead going to try to find ecstatic truths about who this guy was. Where is the joy hidden in between the lines of those notebooks that is so clearly evident in his work? How do we find that? And so going over there was about being in that space that he occupied, going into the natural world in the way that he did, spending dozens of days with our camera crew trying to find truths about nature in the way that he sought those truths, and having we wanted to make it a film about this Italian figure. We didn't want an Anglified Leonardo, so we wanted to go and understand the flow of things in Italy, and it was fun. But just being there and occupying that space was going to help us discover truths about him that we couldn't find, sort of bouncing back and forth and going over there periodically with our crew. It meant that we could be writing a scene about a painting, and then, before sitting down at our computers, we could go to the Uffizi and stand in front of that painting and do it multiple times and try to know more about it. Do it at a time when there wasn't a throng of people in the Leonardo room, but it was just the two of us standing there. And take everything that we had heard from the people we had interviewed or what we had read and just try to find one thing that was our own about it and apply that to our filmmaking.
Yeah, there's something amazing too. We were in Florence, though we shot all over Italy, but we lived in Florence, and it's a place that has obviously changed in 500 years, but not that much. And so there's something really amazing about walking around on these stone streets, and you really feel, it's a city that also very much sort of dines out on its Renaissance history and celebrates it. And
we know a little bit about that in Gettysburg,
Yeah, fair enough. And so you can really feel a connection. The streets are named after these characters, and we lived near there was a little piazza named after Verrocchio, his teacher. And whose studio was a few blocks away from where we lived. It's gone now, but you're like, oh, this is the spot. Here's where Michelangelo was. There was something really meaningful about that, of being immersed in the place, of being able to go to the Uffizi and see the paintings, and also just to be like, oh yeah, I can picture that thing when we talk about this place. And there's a scene early in the film where we talk about his training and what was going on in Florence when he comes as a young teenager to apprentice. All of the incredible sort of craft work that people were doing, and the bottegas where he learned, and the kinds of work they were doing. And we went and filmed these very close-up shots of people doing that kind of work as part of that, illustrating that. And those were all shot in Florence of artisans who are actually, carving wood frames and gold plating them and making jewelry and making, woodwork and leather and all of these crafts that people are still doing there in ways that are not that far removed from how they would have done that with similar tools in the Renaissance.
So those shots are not necessarily recreations. Those are people doing crafts with techniques that are just.
They were doing them for us.
Yeah.
We were not just sort of showing up at their place of work to film
Yeah.
their normal day. But yes,
It's their daily job is to do this
This is
thing.
what they
Yeah.
do, and maybe we asked them to use, the old tools and not the newer machine, but they have those old tools. Like we weren't making that up, and
Wow.
they were in many cases really interested in that. The fact of that process. So, the jewelry maker we went to talk to him about it, and that was another thing about being there, is that you could go find these places. We went to talk to him about it, this goldsmith, and he's like, yes, and he pulls these books down off of his shelf about Verrocchio and his jewelry making, and he's like, see, this is the kind of thing he would make, and I can make it just like this. And I mean, they're excited about that. It's meaningful to them that they're recreating these forms of art and craft centuries later.
Yeah, wow. Italy more or less responded favorably to you making this? Was there any resistance to Americans coming in, and did they understand the Florentine and the tradition you guys are coming out of here? Or was it like, what are Americans doing in our...
Well, I think we always presented as saying, we're making a movie about Leonardo for an American audience, and any help you can give us would be greatly appreciated. Because they have a great ownership of him. But I think my favorite comment that I ever heard in the wake of a screening was by an Italian who said, he sort of exists in our world as a god, and I think I experienced him as a human through the movie.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and especially for, unlike Muhammad Ali, we had to do a lot of the heavy lifting because there aren't recordings of him. He's not on film. He didn't really write about his feelings, and so I think in part that was because our allegiance were his notebooks. But also, I think the musical score is beautiful, and
Absolutely.
I think the way that Caroline Shaw, our composer, made music that had both vocals, strings, and percussion, I think it helped lift his humanity. You can feel in some of those sequences, that the room full of teeth, their voices, and to me, it always kind of pointed at his humanity, the thing they were doing, and so. It was fun to make a movie there because people always grumble about Italian bureaucracy if we try to do anything there, and we're like. And everything people said was absolutely true. You try.
Don't recommend it.
Yeah, we sat down with the folks at the Cenacolo, the museum where the Last Supper is, and right away they quote an exorbitant fee for one day of filming, and they said you can play the movie one time within the next 2 years, and then we would agree to it. And we go, why would we make a movie that we could only show once? What sense is that? I had to sit there trying not to laugh. I thought I was on a hidden camera show or something. But eventually, in the Italian way, you talk and eventually, and it's, well, for you, we'll do this thing. And we got 3 hours with that painting, and it was extraordinary. It's really coming off the wall.
Yeah.
It now has a texture of decay. And so by shooting it with our great cinematographer, Buddy Squires, you can see that these disciples, that what's left of them, they seem to be trying to free themselves from that wall all these years later. And so that's another reason to have gone there, is that you got to spend time negotiating with these people before they'll give you permission for anything. I remember shooting in the Piazza Signoria, the main city hall, that we had gotten an access point through an Italian producer who was doing locations for us. And we got up to the 8th floor, and it was almost perfect, but we knew there was a roof, and the woman who ran the place, who came at that early hour, said, oh, no, it's just slanted and you'd fall, and I can't do it. And the Italian producer said, give her 50 euro. And she said, oh, come with me. And up there was a patio with tables and cigarette butts all over the ground. Everybody was up there all the time, and there was the perfect view. And so that's not that different than here, a little bit of. Yeah. But I generally find here that the name Ken Burns on these shores means how many doors can we open for you to help you get the thing that you would like to get. And that's that's true everywhere. It's universal. Another great thing that in working with him. And there, people were a little less familiar, but that's also the way business is done there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of done there. Yeah. But yeah, to go to the Last Supper, and that's still there. And of course, today is May 8th, Victory in Europe, and this festival is very much focused on World War II, but we had them. Leonardo was brand new, so we wanted to do it. And so what's the connection? And of course, there is that connection at the very end of your film. We sort of touch on it, that it's these Allied efforts to save not just The Last Supper, but many great works of European art. And in some ways, the European civilization or Western civilization that had come out of Leonardo and the Renaissance was certainly not entirely, but somewhat preserved, and maybe on a human level entirely preserved. But that idea of, and David was, of course, a co-producer on The War, which is Ken's great film on. We're going to see a lot more of that later in this festival. And so this is a slightly awkward transition to talking about the war and the other work that you've done, and very much this transition of Leonardo, not an American character, but in some ways the beginning of Enlightenment, and of course the American idea in a very broad sense. Is there a sense of that, of like the importance of saving, in particular, the Last Supper there, that this could very easily have just been rubble in an Allied bombing or a German, mortar fire or something? I mean,
yeah, I mean that chapel, or the dining hall, it's was largely destroyed. And you can see, I mean, it's incredible in that one image. You can really see it, sort of just the walls on either end with the paintings that survived. And I think that was really due to that great work. And I think that, to preserve it, the sandbags and all of that effort, which I think speaks a lot to people's sense of the value and importance of this, that this is not just about, decorating the wall or having this beautiful thing to look at, but the actual meaning of this thing existing, and it existing for many centuries, and what the kind of legacy of that being handed down. I mean, I think that's what that whole scene ultimately is about, is just the fact that we're still as interested in Leonardo today as we are. This is a person who lived more than 500 years ago, and in so many ways is so distant from our kind of day-to-day lives. And yet the way that, as Dave was saying, the people we interviewed, the passion they felt about Leonardo, the connection they personally felt to him, whether it was about painting or his writing or his scientific explorations, whatever it is like very present and real. I think that speaks to that importance of having that kind of continuity over time of this stuff, that it exists, that we can go look at it. I mean, you can see a reproduction of The Last Supper and it's really cool and you can appreciate what's amazing about that. But I was really struck actually going in there to see it in person is a totally different thing.
yeah, sure.
And it's meaningful to be able to do that, as hard as it is. You get 15 minutes in there and you have to book your tickets months in advance, but it's really worth it. There's something about not just seeing a photograph of it or a reproduction, but actually existing in the space with this stuff, that we need that. We need that inspiration sometimes today.
Well, and it's again, it's this transitory moment, and that's such a defining image. Obviously, the Mona Lisa would fall in that category, and different works, and Michelangelo's works, and so forth. But that it's very much, and now we're in this age of just inundated with images, and we're on the verge of just AI generated images everywhere, and all this. But like, how unique, how special that would have been, and again, it's worth, you can see that image scanned 1 million times anywhere with a quick Google search. But it's that sense of space and the all of that uniqueness of it. And then again, it's this sort of transition to all of our modern world, and and some of the characters you get to in your other films. And so I know we're mostly focused on Leonardo, but it's between Jackie and Muhammad Ali, you've done these sort of iconic American, and they're also in a different but similar way. They're minorities, or they're other, yet they're pivotal figures in changing our culture and our history. What attracts you to these characters? Like, why are you doing these films on these guys?
Yeah, we're trying to put together what would be the most fun dinner party that we could imagine. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not as if we have a list and that we're working through it. But it does seem that these are figures that we can return to time and again to help us make sense of a moment, and for different reasons. I mean, when we have some kind of industrial or technological revolution that we're working through, our interest in Leonardo does seem to swell, and he doesn't seem like a figure who was out there seeking that kind of validation. He was just trying to know as much as he can, but he seemed to be asking questions that were very modern. To me, what makes him so modern also is his imagination, that he could think of those questions, ones that there wasn't a lot out there that would direct him to think of those questions. They were coming from his imagination, and so he's compiled all this knowledge in his notebooks, and he seems to be wanting to, in the way that he wrote, it was very instructive. He seemed to be want to wanting to be reaching a massive audience through those notebooks in a way that Muhammad Ali also seems like a modern figure, beyond advancing sort of beyond his times, but in his times. And when we made that movie, we're watching him fight in his first title fight against Sonny Liston, and the things he's doing in the ring, there's no precedent for them. He's inventing it as he goes along. We couldn't use music from that time because it just felt a little thin. We turned to hip hop. We generally use music in our movies that is of the period that we're covering, but we wanted some sound that seemed to be advancing him beyond these years. And so, and Robinson, with his courage and fearlessness, he's definitely a man of his times, but he, invented himself for that moment as someone who was quiet, who could receive the slings and arrows that were going to come at him, when actually that was the opposite of who he was. He was someone who wanted to be loud and vocal about the shortcomings of his times and how we needed to get forward and advance. And so I think these are men who kind of are of their times, but they're kind of timeless, and they knew the kind of imprint that they wanted to leave. Mm-hmm. Muhammad wanted to touch every single person. He wanted to leave an imprint on everybody, something that they would carry with them, no matter where on the globe that he was. Leonardo wanted to know things that he could share with everyone that would be meaningful centuries later. It's why we turn to him today, and why they are among a small group of people whose likeness that we would see on a T-shirt, that when we're confused and don't know where we are, or the times are confusing, that we can look to them to make a little more sense of them, even though they're long gone.
Yeah, well, they are. I mean, they're transcendent characters, and it's sort of their. I mean, obviously, Jackie Robinson's a baseball player. Muhammad Ali was a boxer, but they certainly transcend their trades in a way I think that Leonardo does too. Yes, he's a painter. I mean, most people would probably call him a painter if you had to nail him down because of those works. But clearly, he was a defense contractor.
Right. That's incomplete.
Like probably a lot better money than that too, right? Like, but. Yeah, just the variety, and it was sort of just the singularness of these individual people, and I think that comes out strongly. That these, yes, they're part of their time, yes, they're part of a movement, if you will, but they are very much transcend that, and those qualities are there. And so, I mean, I think it's special. And then we've talked a little bit about what's coming next for you guys. So what is coming next for you guys?
The project that we're working on right now is a likely 4-part film that we're calling Emancipation to Exodus, or thinking about calling it that, that is about the Black experience in America from emancipation through Reconstruction, sort of beyond into the beginning of the Great Migration, a period in our history that has been probably mistold and misrepresented, perhaps more than any other, and one that feels like we can explore and try to get that history right. Our whole first episode really takes place during the Civil War, but it's not about the Civil War. It's about this process of emancipation that unfolds, that is driven by people self-emancipating and kind of, in some ways, redefining that idea of emancipation even. What does it mean and how does it happen? So we're in early stages. We're writing the script and researching and filming interviews, but it's really feels like a good thing to be working on right now.
I'm sure that's intense. Yeah, for sure. I know. I was on the phone with Dave a couple months ago. You were on like a Georgia Sea Island scouting or something?
Yes.
Looking at
the film sort of begins there.
Yeah.
Months after the Fort Sumter, the start of the war, the Union sets up a blockade, and its first sort of successful invasion is at Port Royal, where they liberate 10,000 enslaved Black people and start a first experiment in Reconstruction long before the war is over. In fact, long before the war is over, that experiment has told us exactly how we're going to respond to the idea of a big sort of repairing with 4 million enslaved Black people of many generations of wrongs done to them, and how it is we're going to choose not to get it right.
Yeah, a lot of curves along that path for sure. Well, anyways, our time is finishing up here, but that's exciting. So when you get that done, we want to have it back here. So it'll be fun to screen that one here. But everybody, Dave McMahon, Sarah Burns, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jake.